Okay, looks like we're connected. Oh, hold on a second. There we go. I think we're happening now. Shalom, this is Gene, and this is Simchat Yeshua Messianic Fellowship. We are going live on Wednesday. This is September 23, 2020, and we're going to be talking about Galatians. We're in chapter 4, second section of chapter 4. And so settle on in and relax and enjoy the show. This is Simchat Yeshua Messianic Fellowship, and we're located in West Covina, California. And I'm going to vent for a few minutes to give people a chance to get in and get logged in. So I'm going to do some of the usual before study YouTube things, like explaining this is Simchat Yeshua Messianic Fellowship. That's spelled SYMCHATYESHUA. And you can find us on the internet at simchatyeshua.org. Or we have a Facebook page also, which is Simchat Yeshua. Okay, so thanks for joining us. Oh yeah, one other thing. I always catch myself not remembering this at the right time, but be sure to like, to tell other people about the study here. Subscribe. That's the other one I was trying to remember. Subscribe and ring the bell so you're notified when we go live, so that you don't miss any of these studies. So, being that this is not Sabbath, I'll talk about a little bit about money. I usually don't, especially on Sabbath. But if you like what you hear, if you want to support the congregation, you can donate to the congregation through simchatyeshua.org. And again, that's SIMCHATYESHUA, simchatyeshua.org. On our website, there we have a way of you being able to donate. So currently, with things being a little bit crazy with our P.O. box, recommend that you do the online donation if you want to do it that way. It's quick, it's easy, and less trouble than writing a check and mailing it to our P.O. box and hope that it gets there. So it's not any problem with the postal service per se, but the post office where we used to have our mailbox no longer exists. And last I heard, they haven't decided what to do about replacing it or just divvying up the territory to the other existing offices. Okay, so see anything else I could? Oh yeah, we have a chat box because some of us are chatterboxes. So if you want to add any questions, comments, or rebukes anywhere along the line with the study, I have to remind myself to look at this chat box more than at the beginning and at the end. But I'll keep checking it from time to time. So if you have a question about something, I'll try to get to it as quick as possible. Have a comment you can add, go ahead. I'll even take rebukes. If you want to disagree, it's okay. That's part of the learning process. That's how you do yeshiva, which is kind of like rabbi school, where you get to not only disagree, but you also get to discuss, and sometimes with a fair bit of energy. So let me get over to, oops, wrong spot. That's not it. That's not it. That's it. Okay. It'll be catching up shortly. I noticed that there's a delay. Sometimes about a minute to about 2 minutes or so. Um, and that just has to do with the fact that I have a crazy internet connection and my running everything off of a cheap laptop. So um, everything works, but not quite as quickly or as thoroughly as desired. But hey, it gets done. So um, let me go for another minute or two, give people a chance to get logged in, and then we'll get started. We are in Galatians chapter 4. Book of Galatians, just a little reminder, was written to a group of congregations in the territory of Galatia, which is modern day country of Turkey along the central north side of the country. Um, at the time, it was a Roman province and it was occupied primarily by Celts. Um, and so, yeah, Celts, same people that play basketball in Boston. Um, but they had migrated from Central Asia into this area, not just this area, but eventually were pushed out and migrated northwest and ended up most famously in Northern Europe and then eventually to England and Ireland and Scotland and in that areas. So at this time, though, that they were hanging out in the region of Galatia. So Shaul, Paul. Um, Shaul is Hebrew. It means asked of God. Sorry, that would be Shemuel. Sorry. Shaul. Um, Good, I'm blanking. Um, yeah, She'elah. So yeah, Shaul. It means to ask or to question. Um, his Greek name is Paul, and it's not an equivalent name. They don't mean the same thing. It's not unusual for Jews in a Jewish community to have a Hebrew name, with which they use amongst the community and within the synagogue, but then have a Gentile name um, that is used for among people that are outside the synagogue or outside the community, and it's quite normal. And so you have in this case Shaul or Shaul, if you want to call it that. Paul sounds somewhat equivalent in sound, and so that's probably why it was. But they're different meanings; they don't mean the same thing. So, um, so Paul, and I'll use the names interchangeably, Shaul or Paul, um, was writing to the Galatian congregation because there was an issue, there was a problem. The root of the problem is laid out for us in Acts 15, where at the beginning of the chapter, it is said that some Pharisees came along and said, you know, all the Gentiles who are becoming believers must become Pharisees or they can't get saved. Well, that was discussed and that idea did not prosper. So they came back later and said, okay, but they don't have to be Pharisees in order to be saved, but they must become Pharisees now that they are believers. And that was a big discussion in Acts 15. And it was decided that no, you can't do that to these guys. James even reasoned that we don't follow all the rules of the Pharisees. Remember, Yeshua was very hostile. Jesus in English, Yeshua, um, both mean salvation, just different language filter. Um, Yeshua himself had great arguments with the Pharisees, not over the significance of God's commandments, but how the Pharisees had used and manipulated those commandments to benefit themselves at the expense of other people that they thought were less religious. And so James admits, hey, we don't even follow all the rules of the Pharisees, so why should we ask Gentiles to do it? Let's do this. Okay, here's 4 of the worst pagan practices of that time. Pay attention to those 4 things, then get yourself into a synagogue, verse 21, and learn Moses, learn the commandments of God, learn Torah. Torah doesn't mean law, Torah means instruction. But in common usage, a lot of times people use the word Torah as if it means law. Um, anyways, make a short story long. Um, so Paul ran into a situation up in the Galatian region where people came as if they were from James, that is, from the Jerusalem congregation, um, saying that you must become Pharisees or you're not part of the family. And that was a very horrible, very bad statement to be made. So Paul writes this letter to the Galatians that says, that keeping God's commandments is important, um, but becoming Pharisees is not at all necessary. And he quotes the two things that are important to prove this is one, the Spirit of God resides within the Gentiles, and that God is doing miracles among them. And between those two, it proves that you don't need to be a Pharisee to be 100% belonging to God and part of his family. And that's what the letter of Galatians is talking about. Where there is some confusion is that Paul no doubt explained these things in detail when he was there in person, but when he's writing a letter, he's only hinting at the stuff that was discussed at length. And as a result, he uses the word nomos in the Greek text that we translate as law um, in two different ways, and they're not the same. One is the obvious God's commandment is God's law, and he says, that's good, right, just, and proper, and we need to do that stuff. Then he also uses the word nomos, though, or various versions of that same root, um, to talk about the rules of the Pharisees. And I try to avoid using the phrase Pharisaic law because that law would confuse with law, talking about God's law. So I usually talk about the Pharisee rules to differentiate. But Paul doesn't differentiate in his letter because I really get the impression he expected that the hearers of his letter would understand the difference in the usage, and the context drives whether or not he's talking about God's commandments or the rules of the Pharisees as that word law. He also uses that same word nomos in a couple different other methods. For example, the law of sin and death, the soul that sins it shall die, and also the law of the members that war within us, um, our evil tendency, our fleshly tendency. Um, so there are other ways that Paul uses that same word, and again doesn't explain the difference. It's understood, it's expected that he would know, that the reader, the hearer, would know. Anyways, make a short story long. Now that we've got sort of a run-up, we're in the second section of Galatians chapter 4, starting at verse 6, but I want to read verses 1 through 5 as a run-up. I'm sorry, actually verse 8 is where we're going. So, now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, does not differ at all from a slave, though he is master of all, but is under guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the Father. Even so we, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying out, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. Okay. So that's a run-up just to pick up to where we're going to start for our study for the day. Here we are in verse 8. But then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those things which by nature are not God's. But now after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months, seasons and years. I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain. Okay, let's take that little segment and let me move over to the study notes. There we are. These should be online, hopefully posted on Facebook as well as on the website. So um, if you want to pull down these notes and follow along, print them so you can, write your notes and write in your comments about how wrong I am. That's okay. Okay, so let's take a look at this, starting in verse 8. But then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those which by nature are not God's. Okay, or the Englishman's Greek New Testament puts it, but then indeed, not knowing God, you were in bondage to those who not by nature are God's. I like using the Englishman's Greek New Testament because I'm absolutely terrible at the Greek, and at least from a little bit I know, this appears to be as close as possible to a word for word translation, which you'll notice sometimes. Um, the syntax is kind of crazy than what we're used to reading in English because the Englishman's Greek New Testament tends to translate word for word more than trying to make the sense out of the phrase, um, which is pretty cool. So I like using that. Okay, so indeed you did not know God, speaking to Gentiles who do not know of God and Torah, God's commandments. Okay, so you did not know God. Okay, and which means you serve those things which are not God, not God's. So not God's there. Not speaking against Torah or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but against pagan ideology and philosophy. So remember, he's writing to the Galatians, and he's writing specifically to the Gentiles in the Galatian region. So before you knew God, you were involved in worshiping things that really weren't God. Okay? And that's basically setting up the next point he's getting to. Okay? Um, Commentary: beings that in reality are non-gods, that is, idols, are one species of elemental spirits. The Gentiles to whom Shaul is writing served them before they came to put their trust in Yeshua. Okay, so so Paul is talking about basically doing a touch point here, saying, you guys know what you served before were not really gods, and everybody hearing this should go, yeah, we know that now. And so he's using that as a premise to make his point. Okay, in verse 9, but now after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage? Okay, but now having known God, but rather having been known by God, how do you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which again anew to be in bondage you desire? Okay, one of the fun things about English syntax is, it sometimes sounds like it's Yoda speaking. Um, Anyways, the point being, um, how do you turn again? Okay, so given the fact that people like to teach Galatians as if Paul is telling people to throw away Torah, throw away God's Old Testament, and start a new relationship with Jesus based on a new understanding of what's right and wrong, not connected to God's commandments. Okay? And yet the word anew is in there, okay? Which desire again to be in bondage, okay, to turn again. Okay? Now, these people never had Torah, so how can you go back again to something you never had? Okay? It's kind of, one of the often counter arguments people give to a Gentile believer in a Messianic Jewish point of view is, oh, you want to go back to the law? No, I never had the law. How can I go back to something I never had? And this is one of the counter arguments that you need to consider when you run into a circumstance, in this part of the letter. Um, and I like to bring this up, and I like to repeat and kind of pound it into people. I know it gets a little bit long saying the same things over and over. Um, but I want you to win the arguments. I really desire for you to learn how to win the arguments. So if I say it often, hopefully it will get into your memory to when you run into a circumstance where you have to discuss this with someone. Um, you know, these words and explanations will come out easily and cleanly and hopefully be persuasive. Remember, the point is to win the argument, not to crush somebody, but to convince them of God's ways being good, right, and just. Okay, so I think I already mentioned this turn again. Since Shaul is writing to Gentiles, the turn again cannot refer to Torah itself. Okay, but rather he defines it as weak and beggarly elements. Okay, Pharisaism, even modern Jewish theology and philosophy, can behave as the gods of this world. And so I'm departing a little from the direct immediate point here, the weak and beggarly elements being the false gods, and yet Yeshua's arguments and Paul follows on that Pharisaism um, still falls into that idea of weak and beggarly elements because it relies on human effort to achieve godly status rather than relying on God's provision to provide us status, um, whereby then we show our love for God by having a desire to learn to live by His ways. So yeah, it's important that you obey God's commandments, but it's done out of love for God and gratitude, not out of a necessity um, to gain a status. You already have the status, and that's Paul's argument in Galatians. You already have all the status you need. So why do you need to convert to Pharisaism? Oh, one other detail I forgot to add. In the conversion process, Paul talks about it, and we'll get into this shortly, um, is that the token of the circumcision is the token of this argument. Not God's commandment to circumcise, but rather the final act of the conversion process from turning away from being a Gentile and becoming a Jew and becoming a Pharisee. It's the last thing a man would do. You go through the classes, you get accepted, you go before the Bet Din, a council, and convince them that you're sincere and you're willing to make this conversion. Then the last things they do with you is when you're accepted, you go to a mikveh. You have tevilah, which is an immersion of baptism. You go down a Gentile, you come up a Jew. And now that you're a new creation, what's the first thing a Jewish male is supposed to do as a new creation? Have a circumcision. So the whole item of the circumcision is the token of the whole conversion process. It's not God's commandment to circumcise, but it is the Pharisee process of converting someone to being a Pharisee. So when Paul says he's against the circumcision, he's not against God's commandment. He's against that conversion. It's not necessary. It's not good for you. The most damaging thing about making conversion in the Pharisee sense in Paul's day and in modern sense in Orthodox is God wants us to keep our word. And so if you make that conversion, you promise to do everything they tell you to do, even if it's wrong, even if it's not biblical. You obligate yourself to do it. And failure or refusal or thinking that no one's going to notice if you don't, yeah, God sees, and you have failed to keep your word. Okay? So that's very, very important. Okay. So I bring as a secondary comment that Pharisaism can also qualify as the weak and beggarly elements, whereas the direct context is talking about the gods of the Gentiles. Okay. Um, and also, another point, uh, this cannot refer to Torah itself. As Shaul points out, Torah is good. Take a look at Romans 7:12. Therefore, the law is holy and the commandment holy and just and good. So if Paul calls it holy, just, and good, how can he tell the Galatians, how can he tell the Romans it's holy, just, and good, and then tell the Galatians it's lousy? You follow me? Yet that's what some people would teach. Take the whole counsel, and Paul cannot contradict God. He cannot contradict Yeshua if he's going to be an apostle of Messiah for God. So if Yeshua is teaching to keep the commandments and he's teaching to keep the commandments, then the times where he writes something where someone might misconstrue it or twist it to say he's saying to not keep the commandments, that's the twister that is wrong, not Paul. Okay. Now I mentioned earlier he didn't do himself any favors by not explaining things in very full, careful detail, but rather hints at stuff that everybody already knew. Which we, of course, divided by much time and culture and language, we don't pick up the fact that we're supposed to know that. There develops then doctrines that are against God and His commandments, and being taught as if that's the proper way a believer should live. Okay. Last bit on this. However, weak and beggarly elements can refer to the Pharisee or modern Orthodox misuse of Torah, requiring more than what God requires for entry into the family of God. And that is the central argument of Paul's letter to the Galatians. That is the whole central point. Okay, that the Pharisees were twisting God's words and adding more to what was required by God for the Gentiles to perform to be like them. And since you didn't need to be like them to belong to God, there's nothing of which Pharisaism and also modern Orthodox can offer that will improve our relationship with God. Okay, let's move on. Verse 10. You observe days and months and seasons and years. Days you observe, and months and times and years. English means Greek New Testament. Okay. Oh, now I remember, myself. I was going to add additional citations and commentaries on this, and when I was doing my review, I reminded myself when I started, and then completely forgot when I was working on this. Now, I'll remind myself. It has to do with within the Tanakh, within the mislabeled as the Old Testament, but it's commonly referred to as Old Testament. There are times when God speaks through the prophets. He's talking about Israel or Judah observing days and months and seasons and years, but they're not God's days and months and seasons and years. They are their own permutations or misuse of God's holy days, what He calls His days and His seasons. And that's exactly the same. You could have picked this right out of the Tanakh, and like a not so bright person, hopefully one of the commentaries will pick up on this, and I won't have to apologize too much further. Okay, let's go on. Compared to Colossians 2:8-23, which is an encouragement to observe Torah, this phrase is the opposite, saying it is bad to follow the religions of the pagan world. You must labor to achieve the God's notice. Alternately, one need not follow the special days and seasons of the Pharisees or modern Orthodox. There are additional days. There are the days that the pagans observe, and we're in that season where people are going to start arguing about certain particular pagan holidays that as believers we may or may not want to avoid as a testimony to the purity of God. I just lost my spot there. Anyways, and that's the pagan stuff, but also Pharisaism and modern Orthodox inserts a lot of additional days and seasons and activities that are not necessarily wrong, but they're not scripture. And so as a messianic point of view, we acknowledge certain special days that's within the Orthodox calendar because there's nothing wrong about them. We can celebrate, or not can we celebrate? We can observe Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Day, the day of the Holocaust, um, which is a good and proper thing to do. Um, but it's not a sin if you miss it or if you don't do it just right by their standards. Okay, um, and so it's a good thing to do. Um, so in and of itself, observing cultural days is not bad. Hanukkah is a perfect example of that. It's not scripturally commanded in the Tanakh, but we know that Yeshua was in Solomon's porch on the day of the Feast of Dedication, which is Hanukkah. So, um, so yeah, he observed Hanukkah. So if he did it, we should do it. Um, although it is not the same level of commandment um, as what God said are His days. Okay. Okay. Second paragraph there. On another view, Shaul is pointing out the Galatian Gentiles observe the correct events in God's design, but are now doing them to earn Pharisee points and not out of thanksgiving to God and belonging to Israel. This is a very big important point because within Pharisaism and within modern Orthodoxy, you can keep Hanukkah, but there's also a ton of rules of how you go about keeping Hanukkah. Do we Gentiles really need to do this? The simple answer is no. If we wish to observe Hanukkah because it's fun, if you want to wish to do Hanukkah because it speaks a very clean message about God's sovereignty and God rescuing His people, yeah, we can do that. But does it mean that we have to follow the tradition of buying a gift for each of our kids for 8 days straight? No, we don't have to. Does it mean, um, we have to spin dreidels and, gamble with gelt, chocolate coins? No, we don't have to. Okay. Um, those activities can be fun, but they're not, sometimes, in my case, the chocolate is just kind of off my diet, so it's not good for me to do that. Okay, so uh, understand that if you're doing what you're doing to earn points, or to see, to appear more religious than others, it's not a good reason. Okay, but if it helps your walk with God, that's a good reason. Okay. Commentary. Judaism, as conservative Jewish rabbi Abraham Heschel eloquently pointed out in his writings, is a religion based on the sanctification of time. Jewish communal life thrives on celebrating biblically prescribed times. The special days come once a week. Shabbat, months are noted at Rosh Chodesh, or the head of the month, celebrated when the new moon becomes visible and commences a month of the Jewish calendar. Seasons include the 3 pilgrim festivals, Pesach, Passover, Shavuot, weeks, or Pentecost, and Sukkot, tabernacles, along with Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, Chanukah, dedication or lights, Purim, lots, and other minor festivals and fasts. The years of the sabbatical year, every 7 years, the Jubilee year, every 50 years, and other years related to tithing, and there may be reference to life cycle events of Milah, circumcision, Pidyon Haben's dedication of the firstborn son, marriage, and the ceremonies related to death. Commentary also to look at 2 Corinthians. But when Gentiles observe these Jewish holidays, neither out of joy in sharing what God has given the Jewish people, nor out of spiritual identification with them, but out of fear induced by Judaizers who have convinced them that unless they do these things, God will not accept them, then they are not obeying the Torah, but subjugating themselves to legalism. And legalism is just another species of those weak and miserable elemental demonic spirits, no better than the idols left behind. And again, that's the point of the letter to Galatians. that we don't need to follow the rules of the Pharisees um, in order to be acceptable to God. Okay, um, so even though some of them might be good things to do, they're not necessary um, as far as guaranteeing your walk with God. An alternative interpretation, however, is that the days, months, seasons, years of this passage do not refer to the Jewish holidays at all, but to pagan Gentile feasts, naturally and directly reflecting those weak and miserable elemental spirits. According to this understanding, Shaul was worried that his ex-pagan converts might be returning to these pagan festivals. Gentile Christians who choose to add a cultural identification with Jews to the spiritual identification they have already made by trusting in the Jewish Messiah, or who enjoy the beauty and significance of Jewish rituals, are, according to Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 8, free to observe them. Since Shaul is writing to correct a Gentile error, since he is writing to the Gentiles in Galatia, since he is the emissary to the Gentiles, his remarks here have no relevance whatever to Jewish believers except as a caution to avoid legalism in general. That is, to use these verses as a wedge to drive Jewish believers away from celebrating Shabbat, Passover, the rest of the Jewish holidays, and other Jewish customs is to misappropriate them for a purpose that contradicts Shaul's teaching and practice. For we know that Shaul himself made substantial efforts as a believer to observe the Jewish holidays, taking a look at Acts 20:16 and 1 Corinthians 16:8 and 9, that the Jerusalem Messianic community surely did so. The New Testament does not oppose Messianic Jewish observance of Jewish holidays. Messianic Jews are, at the very least, free to observe all Jewish holidays and customs without interference with believers and without being subject to any accusations or guilt feeling connected with Judaizing. Did it again. I forgot to check. Anybody is commenting here. Oops, wrong thing. All right. Shalom Ruhama. Okay. Let me get back to our thing here. Okay. Verse 11. I'm afraid for you lest I have labored for you in vain. Okay. I am afraid of you lest somehow in vain I have labored as to you. English, Greek, New Testament. Perhaps a remez, or a hint, remez means hint, to the freedom granted by Messiah, as in Yeshayahu, Isaiah 61 verses 1 through 3, which reads, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to console those who mourn in Zion, to give them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they may be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. Okay. And so all the description about the poor, the brokenhearted, that includes the Gentiles, that includes those who don't know God at the time of this prophecy, and of course later on as people grew up as Gentiles and um, didn't know God's ways. Okay, last comment. Shaul also invokes his status as the teacher and thus father of the Galatian Gentiles. Warning of being pulled astray by Greek Pharisaic elements, you need to labor to achieve status with God, contained within the Judaism of their day. Okay? And so the basic bottom line here is if you are a Gentile coming into the Messianic movement, you are free to observe the commandments of God, to observe the high days, the holy days, the activities to do or to refrain from doing that which God enjoins us. You are free to learn that lifestyle, and um, it is an indication of the quality of your relationship with God. It's not the absolute sign of your salvation. Frankly, none of us live it perfectly, so we would all fail on that litmus test. But it is a sign of your belonging to God, that you want to live by His ways. On the contrary, and this is what Paul warns against in great passion. Um, don't get sucked into thinking that you have to obey the man-made rules as if they're God's rules in order to find acceptance and belonging to God's family. Um, that's not the case. Okay. Um, it does. You are expected to learn, Acts 15:21, a godly lifestyle, which means setting aside some of the old ways and taking up new ways. But as far as doing all the extra details and extra understandings imposed by a Pharisaic or modern Orthodox um, approach, no, you're under no obligation to do so. You already have everything you ever need given to you by God. You already possess it. So there's nothing man-made religious effort can add to what God has already given. Okay? So that's it. This is a little shorter. Last week it went kind of long, and this week it went kind of short. So, any questions, comments, rebukes? Um, I'll start winding down, and if you have anything to add in, go ahead and put it into the comments into the chat boxes, into the chat box, and I will get to it. Okay, you've been listening to Simchat Yeshua Messianic Fellowship. This is our Wednesday evening Galatians study. We are past halfway in the book of Galatians, and I just want to hear from you. What do you think would be a good book to follow once we're done with Galatians? It's going to be some months before we're done, but it's good to plan ahead. So give me your thoughts on that. What would we like to cover, whether it's topical or a book of the Bible? Let me know. Okay, so this is Simchat Yeshua Messianic Fellowship. That is spelled SYMCHATYESHUA.org. You can see us on our Facebook page, Simchat Yeshua, or you can see us on our website, simchatyeshua.org. You feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell, comment. Although I notice I'm not going back to read comments on the old on the old shows. So if you have a comment, put it up in the chat here, and I can get to it. And if you feel like supporting the congregation or the channel, you can donate through the website, simchatyeshua.org, and that way you can help out should you choose to do so. I normally don't talk money, but when it's Sabbath, so this is Wednesday, so it's not Sabbath. And that's it. Any other questions, comments, rebukes before we close down for the day? If I don't get anything, actually at this point, I'm going to go ahead and go quiet and just let the recording run for a few minutes by itself, because I noticed that we have a delay of anywhere from 30 seconds to about 2 minutes, and I don't want to shut it off before everyone gets a chance to hear the end of it. So I'm going to go quiet now. God bless you guys. Have a good week, and go find a good Messianic synagogue to hang out with on Shabbat. These are the high holy days. We have Shabbat coming up. We have Yom Kippur coming up this week. And then shortly after that, Sukkot, Tabernacles, is coming along. So this is coming quickly on my favorite time of the year. And Ruchama's favorite day is Yom Kippur. So she's going to have a good time. Okay, we're all going to have a good time. It's just that for some people, not eating for 24 hours is not fun, but that's okay. We all can do it. It's all doable. All right, I'm going to go quiet now, and in a couple of minutes, we'll just shut things off. So, shalom. God bless you. Shabbat service is at the shul. We 119 Psalms. Actually, there's 150. No, I'm just kidding. Psalm 119. Oh yeah, His word. Um, yeah, it's going to be at the shul. We got permission to resume Shabbat services as well as the High Holy Days. So um, we're back there now. We just have to settle into a learn and settle into a methodology where we're a little more observant of our um, um, COVID instructions. We got a little crazy this last Sabbath, and everyone was just a little too happy, and so we have to establish at least a temporary new normal. Okay, but we'll get it straight. All right. Again, that's it. Shalom. I'll be quiet for a little.